the hardware for bats, what? Because I know dolphins have like a melon in the front of their skull that they use to echolocate. Is there something similar for bats? How does it work as
Yeah.
far as the?
Yeah, so actually, yeah, unlike dolphins, it's very similar to any mammalian, any other non-dolphin or non-tooth whaled mammalian apparatus. So basically, they use the vocal cords just like we do. There are some adaptations. They're finer. There may be more. The tension is higher, so you can produce ultrasound. There's some very fast muscles that allow you to produce signals at a very high rate. But it just looks like a mammalian vocal apparatus. And in terms of the
Hmm.
reception, it's also very similar. So the ears, the inner ear, what we call the cochlea, there's some adaptations inside the cochlea. There's a membrane. In bats, it is again, once again, the tension is higher. It is finer. It allows reception of ultrasonic sounds, but it's very similar to many other mammals. And the big difference, I would say, of course, there are big ears. Some bats will have very big ears. Some bats have facial structures which are related to directing sound. So these are special
Hmm.
adaptations. But I would say that 90% of the adaptation is in the brain. So the brain has neural mechanisms that allows it to process echoes. One of them, one of the mechanisms that we understand best, by the way, the discovery of how this mechanism was discovered is also mentioned, also described in one of the chapters in the book. And this mechanism allows bats to measure range based on time, basically. So the
Hmm.
bat's brain has special neurons that allow it to assess the distance of objects based on the time that passes between emission and reception, emitting a signal and receiving an echo. And this is probably the main, I would say, magic happening in the bat's brain, but we still don't understand much about what's going on further down. How do you downstream, right? How do you translate these? So let's say you get a lot of echoes and they're all coming in at different times or distances. How do you translate this into a scene, a 3D scene, or I don't know if it's a 3D scene, but some kind of scene of the environment? So these are all
Yeah.
fascinating open questions.
And those, the ability to kind of translate it into a 3D scene, humans have that ability too, to somewhat?
Actually, we don't even know if bats have it. So yeah, humans can do
Oh.
some sort of ranging. For example, if I play a sound to you, even without the echo, you can say something about the distance sometimes. The amplitude, the spectrum tells you something about distance. Of course, direction. We're very good in telling the direction of where sound is coming from, especially azimuth, so 2D direction. But in fact, we don't even know for sure that bats can do the full 3D. It's not a simple task from an engineering point of view, because you get two streams of audio, one to each ear. And how do you translate this into a 3D scene? Unambiguous scene is not completely clear. It's also not so easy to test. So in one experiment that we've run, we actually tested if bats can translate acoustic information into vision. So we trained bats to classify two objects that have different textures without seeing them in complete darkness, so only based on echolocation. And then we tested after the bats were able to do it using sound. We tested them in vision, so we allowed them to use vision for the first time and try to eliminate the use of echolocation by generating very loud noise. And indeed, the bats were able to translate, so they managed to identify the objects using vision. So to some extent, this shows that with vision we do have a 3D kind of percept. Probably
Hmm.
the bats have one too. This suggests that sometimes, it doesn't say that they can always create a 3D image, but in this case, it suggests that they can have some kind of a 3D perception of an object based on the echolocation information. But still, we don't know if they can do this always, and what's the accuracy of this 3D reconstruction.
Do we know if they can see color? Because I would imagine
Yeah.
for fruit bats being able to
So first
see
of all, you
color, yeah,
remember,
yeah.
yeah, it's true. With birds, this is super important, right? But you have to remember that most of them operate at night, and thus you don't have much color, right? Because
That's
and
true.
it's much more important also to invest in your night vision. So some bats are, we humans are trichromatic, right? We have RGB, right? Red, blue, green
Hmm.
photoreceptors. Most bats have only two. Most fruit bats only two. Some bats, by the way, can see in ultraviolet. So they have a third
Hmm.
ultraviolet receptor. Still, it's species specific. We still don't know for sure. And I'm not aware of experiments that tested this behaviorally. So all of what I'm saying now is based on looking at the genes for the photoreceptors. So this is another really interesting open question. I think that fruit bats can see. So we're now running some tests, and I think that they can see vision to some extent, but not as good as we can for sure.
Right. The you mentioned just a second ago the what was it? Vision and their ability to see ultraviolet. How do we know that they can see ultraviolet?
So yeah, behavioral experiments have shown that. We know that at night you have more ultraviolet. We know that many insects can see ultraviolet in order to detect flowers, for example. So there are ultraviolet cues out there. This could be probably very
Hmm.
relevant also for like nectar feeding bats, and that's where it has been shown. I don't think we know enough about how they use ultraviolet vision, their ultraviolet vision yet.
How does the testing work to like what are you testing so that you understand that they can see ultraviolet vision? What does
Yeah,
that look like?
maybe I'll answer more generally. I want to know what the bat's sensory, acoustic, echolocation, visual, olfactory limits are, and how do I test it? So basically, we train bats. I mentioned this previously very quickly, and maybe I should have explained. So, for example, I said we trained bats to identify objects based on their echoes. And you could do the same with ultraviolet, for example, right? So this
Hmm.
means that usually the way this is done is that we will have two objects in a room, for example. That would be one way to do it. And then they differ in some sensory aspects. So, for example, in that case, they differed in texture. One object had holes, the other did not. So this is something that we think should create a difference in sonar signature. And you could do the same. You could have one object reflecting ultraviolet and when one will not. And the bats have to learn. You reward them for landing or approaching only one of these objects. And of course, you switch their locations or, so they don't get fixed to a certain location. And this sometimes takes very long. If this is a hard task, it can take about months to learn because, it's not like a human where you can say, this is your task. The bat has to understand what do you want, right? And it might be, for example, two objects might be very different along some axis that I don't even imagine, and I want the bat to learn this specific cue and not something else.
Right.
So this sometimes takes months. Sometimes they don't succeed, and we don't even know. Maybe it's our fault. Maybe we just couldn't explain the task. But this is basically how you do it, and eventually you would see that over time the bat learns to land. It starts by landing on both objects equally, and over time you see that it statistically significantly prefers one of the objects, and then you run some statistical task, a test, and then you can claim that it can do the task.
Do the how intelligent are they? Do they understand tasks easily, or does this take a lot of like you kind of have to put up a whole lot of guardrails?
So intelligence is a tough word, right? Because how do you compare intelligence and how much of it is, as I said, how much of their failure is because of my failure to explain the task. It is interesting. I would say I will say that there's something very interesting that I can say, and that is that there are huge differences between species and huge differences between individuals, and maybe that's I think more
Hmm.
interesting. Um,
Hmm.
so some species are really learners. They're really flexible in their behavior and they will learn, and some are not. Again, maybe I'm not building the task in a way that is suitable for these species, but it seems like something that has to do with their general flexibility. And by the way, this is also correlated with we often distinguish generalists from specialists. So some species are very generalist. They will forage everywhere. They will eat everything. They will roost everywhere. And some are very, very specialist. They have very strong preferences. And this is often also correlates with their learning capacities, I would say. And you also see differences between individuals, which is really interesting. So often there are
Hmm.
individuals that will learn very quickly and others that will not. for example, young individuals are often very curious. They will test the setup, but sometimes they will learn fast, and then they will be very fixed, and they will not learn something new. So there are a lot of nuances that are very interesting. Very similar to, with if I would do this with humans, it would probably I would see very similar differences.
Right.